AP students, this is a lecture on Renaissance art and artists, and I'm going to take you through what art was like prior to the Renaissance so you can really see how it has changed over the time of the Renaissance, and just understand that Renaissance art varies from region to region and from place to place. And while you can apply certain tenets to it and say this is in general what Renaissance art was like, there's always the exceptions, so just be aware of that. In order to understand Renaissance art and how different it was from the art from before the Renaissance, which was called either Byzantine art out of the area of Constantinople, which would be modern day Turkey, to another type of art that was called Gothic art. So Middle Ages art in general, you've got to understand what it was like so you can understand how Renaissance art was so different. So Middle Ages art is going to be art that reflects the ideas of Christianity. It is religious in nature. Its point is to educate the masses of people about what they believe and what's important. And you'll see that in the art is primarily displayed in churches, because that is where people would gather and sit, and churches during this time period are only going to hold Mass in Latin. And so most of the people sitting in the pews would not understand what was being said. They also did not have a Bible that was translated into their language, so they wouldn't have been able to read a Bible if they could read, because the Bibles were mainly in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. So given that situation, how do people know what they believe? Well, a lot of the paintings would tell them the main and most important stories of the Bible. Most of the art was one-dimensional or flat. This idea of creating perspective and a vanishing point was something that came from mathematical calculations during the Renaissance. So most of the art you're going to see is not very realistic. It is forward-facing because it was really hard for people to draw profiles. But if they do have profiles, you'll see that there's no depth, and it's oftentimes a little awkward-looking. It is unsigned for the most part. Art was not signed in the Middle Ages because the point was for it to be displayed in a church and to bring glory to God. So it followed kind of some basic formulas. A lot of times they called it iconography, which was the idea that you would have different icons, something that represented Jesus that would be hanging so that you could be reminded of the important ideas of the Christian faith. So again, Middle Ages art, not very realistic. Giotto is considered the father of Renaissance art. That means that his art is kind of that bridge between the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And so you start to see some changes, but for the most part, it still has a lot of the very Gothic elements. This gold is very Gothic, and this idea that you are displaying a very religious idea, which is Mother Mary here with baby Jesus, but also you are starting to see the beginnings of the Renaissance art. You're starting to see depth. You have stairs going up to Mary. There's an attempt to kind of show that she's in kind of a little temple-y area here. There's an attempt to show that the different sizing of people. Obviously, this baby Jesus still looks like an old man, and I'm going to show you a little video about that. But there's an attempt to show depth. The idea that there are angels in the foreground and there's people in the background. The problem with this is you don't see that the people in the foreground are bigger than the people in the background. So while it's an attempt to show depth, you're not quite seeing all of the changes that the Renaissance art will really start to master this idea of depth. So we're going to watch this little video on babies during like Renaissance art, but also art of the Middle Ages and how they always look like ugly old men. So we'll start with that right now.
So you're going to the museum and it's great. The guards check your bag to make sure you won't, I don't know, shoot a painting. You go up some fancy escalators, you see naked statues, and then it happens. You see a super ugly medieval baby. Why do medieval babies look like ugly middle-aged men? I mean, this baby looks like he wants to tell you that a boat is just a money pit. It might seem like medieval artists were just bad at drawing, but it turns out that babies in medieval art are actually ugly for a reason. While there were breakthroughs in anatomy and perspective that happened later in the Renaissance, Ugly medieval babies were an intentional choice before that time. Somebody told you to paint like Pablo Picasso and you gave them Norman Rockwell, you'd have screwed up. And it was the same way for medieval artists working in churches in Italy. It's because most of these babies were depictions of Jesus and Mary. They were influenced by the idea of the homunculus, which is Latin for little man. These babies look like Benjamin Button because philosophers believe Jesus was born perfectly formed and unchanged. The adult Jesus was represented in the baby Jesus, until the Renaissance when everything changed. Generally, we think of the Middle Ages as lasting from around the 5th to the 15th century, and it kind of overlapped the beginning of the Renaissance in the 14th century. Renaissance probably began in Florence, Italy, but it's important to note that it unfolded over centuries and countries in a time when everything moved slowly, so it wasn't instant beautiful babies everywhere. Still, the change in style did happen, and it happened for a couple of reasons. Suddenly, places like Florence were getting richer, and churches weren't the only places that could afford paintings. People could get their own babies painted, and they wanted them to look like cute, chubby babies, not homunculi. And because the Renaissance was all about classics, they looked at Greek and Roman art, which was all about idealized forms that ditched the medieval abstraction for beauty and... Okay, who put that ugly baby there? Anyway, the point is that after the Renaissance, cherubs didn't seem out of place, and neither did cuter pictures of baby Jesus as the Renaissance spread through Europe. And it's kind of stayed that way since. We want babies who look like they need their cheeks pinched, not their prostates checked. We want them chubby and cute, and we want babies that fit our ideals. Because those medieval babies, they have a face that only a mother could love.
So why did art start to change? So let's look at some basic reasons why you see this adjustment in art from the late Middle Ages to the Renaissance. A new term maybe for you is this term laity, which means the average people in the church pews. It would mean that people outside of the church power structure, like the bishops and the cardinals and the popes, they're going to start to become more powerful as trade increases, as people's economic opportunities post-plague increase. You're going to start to see them become more powerful. And as that video just showed, people then wanted to take that money that they had earned and express it and use it for a virtuous thing. And so one of those things was to commission and be a patron of the arts. And so you started to see art produced for other reasons, art produced to go in someone's home. And so that meant that as the church lost power and lost resources and money, that they were less likely to be the only people who commissioned art. And so art would change to appeal to people's newfound interest in the classics. And so you'll start to see paintings about Greek and Roman gods and mythology. And you'd start to see more attempts and willingness to break rules because it wasn't all about the church and all about the leadership and what they required them to paint. Also, education is going to become more secular, meaning more non-religious. And as education becomes more secular and people have more access to information from all over the world, they start to become interested in different things. And as a result, you start to see the paintings reflect that. Now, the Renaissance will start in Italy, just as a lot of the increased trade from the Mediterranean, that's where it happened, and that's where the wealth started to accumulate in the late Middle Ages in Europe, and as a result, that's where the Renaissance will start. And so Renaissance art will also start in Italy, and it will slowly spread north, and as it does, it adapts and changes to the desires and the focus of the people in the Netherlands and Germany and England. So let's look at the subject and the style of Renaissance art. So some just things that while you're going to do your Renaissance art project, you might be thinking about when you look at your piece of art. Does your art do these things? Because if it does, then that is a great example of why it is Renaissance. So first of all, does it embrace the natural world? Does it try to show earth and nature as it is? As you notice with the Gothic paintings in the back, it was just gold. There was an attempt to actually show trees and landscape, anything like that. So you're going to see Renaissance art start to focus and embrace the natural world. Human emotions. Is there a smile on a painting? The Mona Lisa is a great example of there's emotion in that painting. It seems somewhat blank, but there is emotion. Looking back at Giotto and some of the Middle Ages artists, you don't see emotion on the faces of any of the saints or in any of the religious figures. So look for human emotions. Additionally, look for mathematical order. A lot of times Renaissance art will be very symmetrical. So you'll see if it's a building, and you can have Renaissance art and architecture. So if it's a building that's created, you would see equal numbers of doors and windows on both sides to make it symmetrical. You'd also see an attempt at a certain amount of symmetry in the layout of tiles. And then in paintings, they reflected that. If they valued a certain number of columns, you would never have it off balance. So you'd make sure to have the symmetry. So one side is almost a reflection of the other side. And same thing, a lot of times while they wanted to show human emotions and they wanted to show that they could create that, they also wanted the body to be very symmetrical. So they wanted to show an idealized form of what man could look like. And it's a great example is if you get a chance to look at Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, that is an example of that symmetry that's so important. Proportional. Now, this is something they don't necessarily completely accomplish during the Renaissance, but that idea that you can make things look like the size they really are while creating depth. So somebody who is in the foreground of a painting should be bigger than someone in the background of a painting. And so you'll start to see that attempt at creating things that are proportional. Also attempting to create like babies and make sure that they're proportional and they actually look like what a baby would look like. Shading becomes very important. A lot of times they'll have new shading techniques that are developed during the Renaissance to allow you to see a background and you can tell it's farther away. Shading to make sure that you see like the rolls of baby fat or the rolls of a garment so that it looks like there's depth. They'll use shading for that. There's also linear perspective, that idea of finding the vanishing point and then making a painting that reflects that linear perspective. Later, in late Renaissance, you're going to have something called mannerism develop, and that's where you're going to see that it deviates from these things. Once they figure out how to do it, then artists like normal people don't want to just always do what they've always done, so they start to change it. So mannerism, you'll start to see paintings that are off balance, purposefully off balance. You'll start to see bodies that instead of reflecting exactly how they're looking, they'll have what's called an S shape. So you'll start to see a body that's laid out and almost looks like a serpent in the way that it's shaped. And they're just messing with the techniques and what they've gotten good at and trying to push themselves. So early in the Renaissance, art is primarily corporate art. That means that you don't have these rock star artists like Da Vinci yet, but they work in groups, in guilds and religious fraternities, and they create, it's like a workshop, and they all work together and they create art together. Eventually, you're going to have people who become so popular that they're able to create art by themselves, and they will have wealthy patrons who support them. So Michelangelo is a great example. He lived with the Medici family, and he was so popular that he had a name. He was known by himself, but he started out working with other artists, and he is most known for, in Italy, the David, which is a sculpture. Now, Michelangelo is also a great painter as well, but much of his artwork was also sculpture. You're also going to get a chance, hopefully, in the Medici video, you saw Brunelleschi's dome, which is a feat of engineering as well as beauty. And then Ghiberti's baptistry doors are very popular because it's a great example of using 3D, because he's going to make panels out of bronze, and they're going to tell different stories of the Bible. But they are created in such a way that you see emotion in people and all that kind of stuff, and you see depth that you wouldn't have seen prior to the Renaissance. And the other thing about Ghiberti's doors, and I'm going to show you an image of it in a second, is that he photobombed his own doors. He put his face on them. So it's a great example of that movement away from giving glory to God to artists becoming their own rock stars. One of the most famous sculptors and later painters is Michelangelo Buonarroti, who did these two. One is in Florence, the David, and the Pieta is in Rome in St. Peter's Basilica. And you can see the focus on the naturalism and trying to show man how he really was, and with emotion. There's a lot of idealized form. Now, it changes over time. So the was done earlier in Michelangelo's career, and the Pieta was done later. And you start to see the beginnings of mannerism in the Pieta because you start to see the form more in the S shape, and then you also start to see more emotion and more exaggeration, whereas the David just looks like a real focus on the perfect nature of the human body and focusing on man and his ability to accomplish great things, but not so much on showing maybe the frailty and the humanity of man. This is Brunelleschi's dome. It's freestanding. It was made with small bricks, and it was a masterpiece during the time period, but it's still one of the largest freestanding domes in the world. And just the technology and the science and the math going behind the ability to create this dome is amazing, and it is amazing in person as well. We're going to talk about the baptistry doors that go with this basilica in Florence. What I want to show you right here is, I don't know if you can see it, I'm going to circle it with my cursor. Right here, looks like almost like an octagon shape. This is the baptistry. It's right next to the church, and one of the things you need to understand is you can't enter the church unless you are baptized. So most of the old cathedrals would have a separate baptistry building where people would be baptized, and then you'd walk across the court and you'd enter the church. There are doors all around the baptistry, and there was a competition to see who would be able to design these doors, and Ghiberti won, and these are some of his doors. They have panels. So they have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 panels. They all tell different stories from the Bible. And right above, you've got kind of some handles here and some knobs to pull. These knobs right here he put his own head, his own profile coming out of the door as like handles. So talk about the focus. It's supposed to be, this is a religious commission, obviously, but the focus, he's even finding a way to bring focus to the artist. So we're a long shot from don't sign your artwork because it doesn't bring glory to God to, hey, put yourself in your artwork and make it the main way that a person opens the doors to the baptistry. I mean, think about it. Has access to God is by touching Ghiberti's head. So as corporate art diminishes, you're going to start to see individuals who have wealth. Oligarchs are wealthy individuals, a lot of times nobility, and princes that are going to start to fund art as a part of their virtuous activity. They become patrons. It's like a form of philanthropy. So one of the most famous is Lorenzo de' Medici, and you will watch that movie about the Medicis, and I think you will come to find him a very interesting figure. But he was a patron of both Da Vinci and Michelangelo and many other artists. Life is about cities and not warfare now. So people are not employing knights, and as a result, they have a lot more resources. So you can see in Mantegna's, both of these pieces of artwork kind of show this attempt to show depth. And so there's still some challenges as you see. You have almost what's called a foreshortening. This man, they're trying to show him lying down, coming towards you, almost like 3D out of the picture. And so as a result, the legs become shorter than the arms. It looks like his arms are too long. So they're still working with this skill of showing depth. Look at the emotion on these faces. Again, this is the top. This is a fresco on top of a palace. This is a Renaissance outside. This is architecture, so I just wanted to point out the symmetry that is occurring here. So you have a window here, and then it's reflected on both sides in some of the fresco work done on the outside. Then you have the doors, and then the equal number on each side of columns, as well as 2 other doors. And then you have this is a side yard to this church. But just you get this idea of symmetry that's so important, and balance that's so important. A few more paintings just to give you an idea of what's happening. You have Botticelli up on the top left, and he's painting things that made a lot of political leaders unhappy. A lot of times it looks like this is a situation just after these 2 figures have had sex, and so there's this idea that it is not very religious in nature. Botticelli painted a lot of Greek and Roman mythology. And so you had people who reacted against Renaissance art and artists by condemning it and saying it was unchristian. And one of the most zealous of those was a monk by the name of Savonarola. And he was responsible for an event in Florence called the Bonfire of the Vanities, where he essentially had people gather up all of their wealth and their riches and paintings that didn't bring glory to God, and they threw it on the fire and burnt it. And actually, a lot of Botticelli's paintings were burnt by him. Botticelli threw them on the fire himself. But this was because political powers were changing in Florence, and the Medicis were out of power, and so people were starting to question all of this luxury and focus on the Renaissance. So then Botticelli on the right will go back to still painting and painting some very beautiful things which show depth and everything, but it's back to the focus on religion. So this is the nativity scene that Botticelli painted. So you see that sometimes painters had to respond to who was in power and what they were allowed to paint. So the Northern Renaissance is going to take Renaissance art but adjust it to their resources. So in the South, they did a lot of frescoes, and that was done wet paint and wet plaster that would harden, and you have to work really fast. And it works for warmer climates, and it still deteriorates actually pretty rapidly, but it was better for warmer climates. But when you get up to north, frescoes would not work. They would freeze too quickly, making them unworkable, and then they'd crack too fast from the cold weather. So in the Northern Renaissance, techniques changed as well as subject matter. The Northern Renaissance had a tendency to be more focused on religion, but you're also going to have slowly a movement away from just religious figures to, as the Protestant Reformation flows throughout Northern Renaissance, you're going to start to see people having paintings done of their own houses, of their own things that they own, of their families. So there becomes more of a focus on the family and the local area instead of this larger church being the Catholic Church. So you will see changes over time in the North even. So when I'm talking about the Northern Renaissance, I'm talking about the German states, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, Belgium, Burgundy and France. So those are some of those areas. And they have fewer wealthy merchants, but they do have large cities. So again, you're not going to see as much, the patronage is going to be a little different. You're not going to have like these powerful Medicis and these banking families, but you will have people who commission art for their homes. And as they do start to, like specifically in the Netherlands, there's a lot of trade that goes on in that area. You're going to have the Dutch East India Company come out of there. And so they're going to have some wealth to also spend on art. So because the Northern Renaissance is more rebellious of the church and they have the printing press really starts taking off there, there are a lot of humanists in the North who want reform. So a lot of the Renaissance ideas are going to start spreading through literature, and then it's going to move into the art. So the art is kind of slower to pick up the ideas of the humanists and the Renaissance. They're more concerned with the look of the art and that it's appealing and less worried about mathematical principles. So you won't see quite as much symmetry, as much geometry. It's not that it's not there, it's just not the focus. You will see more color because they're going to be more likely to use oil paints and to paint pretty heavily on, a lot of times they painted on wood because they had forests. And there will be more detail. They will have also stained glass windows because windows for the weather were more important, so art became doing windows as well. There won't be any frescoes. Marble was not as easily obtained, so you won't see marble statues. They will use wood to paint on. And many of the paintings in the North were more religious, but you can't always say that. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but just to give you a visual, and some of these you'll have an opportunity to choose for your artwork, Renaissance art assignment, but just see the vividness of the color, the depth, the detail, So many people in paintings, so much emotion, so much vivid, bright color. But a lot of times you get this sense that it was painted for a private residence or for a person who wanted to display what they had accomplished. Less likely that you're going to see as much public art. This will be more private art. So that's it for our Renaissance art presentation. There's so many more. We could spend forever on this. I'm sure it could be a whole class. But what I want you to do is make sure that you understand the difference between Southern art and Northern art. You're going to see very little mythology in Northern art, a lot less Greek and Roman, because honestly, Greek and Rome are farther away. So that the use of the mythology and stuff like that, not as much in the North. It will be more religious, and it will be more likely to be like dark colors and using oils. You're going to have fewer uses of pastels. You're going to have fewer statues. And so it is a change, but overall you see a focus on people and their experiences and their emotions and humanity, which is the kind of the focus of the Renaissance.